Hello, I'm Roger Lursman, one of the trustees here at the Putnam County Historical Society in Clyda. And several years ago, we constructed this annex building to our museum and have just pretty well finished putting in a lot of the interesting displays that we would like people to see about the history of Putnam County. I'm going to explain a few of the things more related to the farming industries that grew up here. As many of you know, Clyda was part of the Great Black Swamp. The Great Black Swamp was an area that was unsettled for a lot of years. In fact, early Indians even avoided it because of the conditions that were there. And eventually, people began settling in this area, but they had to provide drainage for their tiles and everything. And being muddy, one of their parts of their costumes were probably these types of wooden shoes, because they wouldn't get soaked like leather shoes would. And they often dug trenches by hand to drain the water from their fields. They had planks or boards laid at an angle in the bottom of the trench to provide a tunnel for the water to run through. Later, they developed clay tile, and many of the towns in the area established a place to produce clay tile. Glandor, Ottoville, quite a few others had those. So farmers would put clay tile in their field to drain the swamp. The other condition that they had to deal with was the fact that mostly trees grew very well in the swamp, except along the riverbanks. There were some open areas there that some of the earliest settlers started. In fact, to travel through this black swamp area, the best way was to travel down the rivers that were there. So many of the towns were built along a river somewhere, or like Ottoville around a canal. The trees were covering all of the land. Today, when you drive through the farmland, you see a lot of open fields. That wasn't there. When you drive by a woods, the thickness of those trees were very similar to what was over the whole area. And so those farmers had to cut them down and then deal with the stumps. There were several tools that were used to cut them down. The axes, obviously, at that time were an important part of it. And sometimes you also had to help dig out the stumps with picks or adze, which are some of these. To cut the logs up, you would have saws, including these crosscut saws that were up there for that. And then what you did with the logs often was to construct a house to live in. And next door to our farm scene here, we have a replica of a log house. And the logs were sealed with mud or clay in between the cracks that were there. And it was comfortable for the early people at the time. But farming was very hard. The stumps that you couldn't dig out by hand were often blasted out with dynamite. And the youngsters in the family would often have to go out and pick up chunks of wood and pile them somewhere. So eventually the farmer could clear an acre or two that maybe he could plant some corn on and other crops. Way to plant the corn was maybe use a hoe and dig through different things, and there are some hoes up here. But another device that was used was a corn jabber. This device was where you would have seed in this pocket and push into the ground, go like that, and the seed would drop. Do the next one, do the next one, like that. That was how an early small patch of corn would develop. Now remember, most of this was in the late 1800s when the power was provided by horses. The horses included a device called a halter that would go, not halter, yoke that would be there, and they could attach different instruments to them. Here we have a single tree, which was attached behind the horse and to the other objects that were being pulled behind, like a plow. But early settlers maybe didn't even have horses that they would use. They might have had oxen, and this is a yoke that was used by oxen. So we've got quite a bit of antique instruments that were here. As I said, the early settlers first began along the river somewhere. In fact, my great-great-grandfather settled along the river just north of Fort Jennings and woke up New Year's Day into this much water by his cabin. The snow melt of the warm New Year's Eve had flooded the All Glaze River. And so he gathered his wife and 2 daughters and climbed up onto the roof because the river was flowing wildly out behind there. Neighbors happened to see their predicament and went and tried to get some help. 2 young boys got in a boat, went branch to branch to get to his house, and while the river was, raging, and were able to rescue the wife and the 2 daughters, and then came back for him. And just as they got him in the boat, the river swept the house away, and all the farm things that he had developed at that time. After staying with neighbors for a while, he eventually moved to Delphus, and that's where the homestead began established. And if it wasn't for those 2 boys rescuing them, I wouldn't be here, because that was my great-great-grandfather. But they settled along the river because those were cleared areas. The river would periodically flood, so the trees didn't grow very big or very thick. So you had kind of an open area where you could build a house, where you could farm. But to clear the thicker woods, which you see today when you're driving around, it took a lot of manpower and horsepower in order to drag those logs to where they needed to be. You want to keep going?